it's okay. So shall we just dive right in?
Go for it.
All right. So yeah, a very warm welcome, Joost. So I'll just say, who is Joost, and I'll let you, of course, introduce yourself. The way I know you is you're the CEO and founder of the Open Foundation, and I think a few other adjacent organizations and initiatives. And probably 10 years ago or something like that, I was a volunteer. I remember doing a bunch of translations of interviews with scientists and excerpts and abstracts of scientific articles. And it's a very interesting field, of course, and I imagine that's why you're in it. So I guess just right off the bat, I'd like to ask you, who are you? How would you introduce yourself to people listening and watching? Who's Joost Breeksema?
I mean, there are so many different kinds of answers to that question, right? But if you consider the question professionally, I would actually say I'm the executive director, because the Open Foundation is a charity, is a nonprofit. So we don't have CEOs, but it's kind of in the same realm. I'm also a researcher. I am a postdoc at the University Medical Center in Groningen at the Department of Psychiatry, where I mostly do qualitative research into psychedelic experiences, and then particularly in the treatment of different mental disorders. But I also, as of recent, coordinate a large European network to train 60 new PhDs around psychedelics, very interdisciplinarily. So we just finished recruiting candidates from neuroscience to psychiatry to ethics to law, and everything in between and beyond. And that's exactly where my fascination with psychedelic also lies. I mean, it's something that's really hard to grasp and to pin down. And there are so many different angles from which you can study it. And this is just academically, and there are other knowledge systems that you can use or study. And I think we can continue studying it for a very long time, because the fascination, I mean, the subject is so hard to grasp that there will remain a lot to be studied. And I feel like we won't ever fully grasp it anyway, maybe not scientifically at least.
Thank you. That immediately gets me into a kind of question, because you're kind of alluding to the mystery of the subject, of those molecules. One question that I immediately want to ask you, I guess first off, I want to ask you, what drove you? I guess you just answered it, right? It's your fascination, but do you remember what kind of sparked your initial fascination with this subject matter?
Yeah. I mean, I remember I was quite young when I finished high school. And before I started university, I did an exchange year in Brazil, where I lived for a year. And then I had to figure out what I wanted to study. And I was always interested in big questions. So my options then were astrophysics and philosophy. And I don't have a beta brain at all. I'm terrible at maths. So I figured out pretty quickly that wasn't for me. So I went on to study philosophy, and just, I had this curiosity about other perspectives. That's, I guess, why I went to Brazil as well. And philosophy is an excellent academic discipline for that. And, I think my like immediate fascination with psychedelics started through self-experience. I was 18, 19. I live in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands we have what we call smart shops that can legally sell, at that time still at least, psilocybin containing mushrooms. So, after having a psychedelic experience myself or oneself, and this is something that you see in many people who have experience with altered states of consciousness, whether or not through psychedelics, they become fascinated by trying to figure out how it's possible that something seemingly small can so rapidly and to such a degree change your perspective and open your mind in ways that you didn't even know were possible. So I think that's twin origins, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things you also just said is that you're working with so many different kinds of people in the sense of their professional, their occupation. So one of my questions that comes up is, can you meaningfully research psychedelics without having had such an experience? It's a bit of an ethical gray area, maybe because of legal reasons, but what is your kind of human intuition about that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there are tons of researchers out there who study psychedelics and who have had no personal experience with psychedelics. And that can also be because they do things in the brain or in the mind or in, other kinds of animal test subjects or in cultures that people are just really keen on understanding. And you don't need to have personal experience with a psychedelic to have that fascination.
Yeah.
But I think it's a different question when you talk about treating other people with psychedelics. So if you're someone who guides someone else through a psychedelic experience in the context of therapy or, in other contexts, in ceremonial contexts, the same is true. The question of whether you need to have had a psychedelic experience yourself becomes really different. And it's, it's a subject of debate, and it's very interesting. I always find it interesting to see that people who've not had that experience themselves need much more convincing, or who are much more on the side of, you just need to be a good therapist in the first place, which is also true. And you need to be empathetic, and you need to be able to put yourself in the perspective and the narrative of your patient or your client, which is also true. But then, having firsthand experience and, knowledge of the terrain, or a little bit of the potential terrain that somebody can enter into, and the sensitivity to outside influences, and the how someone else puts themselves in front of you, before you, the trust and the rapport and the relationship that you need to have to be able to surrender to the experience. Those are all things that you can, bring across theoretically, but only when you've experienced it yourself do you get this, this really honed sensitivity, and can you also put that into practice yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it touches actually on one of the questions I was thinking about asking you, which is that it seems to be the case, and you probably have a better view on that than me, but it seems to be the case that there are quite a lot of people who are, who had an amazing psychedelic experience, and then now they also want to be a healer or a facilitator and everything like that. And I already see a bit your reaction in your face, and I'm curious, what do you see in that field? And it seems so obvious that there is damage that is easily coming from that. What is your experience with that?
Yeah, no, it is quite funny because it is a bit of a cliche too. And it's a cliche, obviously, because it's true. But there is something, what I alluded to earlier, people who've had that experience, they become curious and fascinated. And for some people, how that translates is that they feel like, I've had an amazing experience, and I think that other people need to have that too. And the medicine or the mushroom or the Mother Ayahuasca called me to deliver it to people. And like it's an immense, tremendous shortcut to something that requires a lot of training. I mean, if you look at healers or shamans in cultures where the use of psychedelics is integrated, it's years and decades of training and sitting alongside more experienced people in their culture before people are allowed to practice it by themselves. And I mean, it's a risk that we as the Open Foundation, we also saw in the context of psychedelic therapy, because a lot of the work that is happening these days, it's funded and it's organized by pharmaceutical companies, by biotech startups, and they obviously need therapists to run the trials for them. And because it's clinical research, and clinical research is very costly. So this is me putting on my understanding hat. They can only do so much in training therapists, right? And the courses that they provide to therapists are, usually relatively short. And I think that we are nearing the point where psychedelics might get approved by regulatory agencies. And I mean, if you need more explanation, I'm happy to provide it in a minute. But the way it works is that, you need to prove the safety and efficacy of any new kind of intervention. And this has to go through the pharmaceutical drug development system, through regulatory approval. Um, but that is for some compounds, that is, they're nearing the finish line. And I think that when they do get approved, and it will be possible for clinicians to prescribe psychedelics, I think you need to have people ready who have a very deep understanding of what it's like to work with psychedelics. And, we set up a training program last year for people who are already good therapists, who are already seasoned clinicians, who've had experience working psychotherapeutically with clients, but who want to, add a layer of depth to their work. So we put together a 2-year training program that includes, or that actually as a central feature has, experiential training where people undergo experiences with psychedelics, which we can do here in the Netherlands legally, and learn as much as possible from it. And the beautiful thing is, you can make mistakes in such a context. It is not therapy. It is really meant as an educational learning experience. And you can make mistakes, and people who facilitate within our team, who facilitate the sessions, they can do things that they may not have liked, but everything is an opportunity for learning. And it's really powerful and deep learning that happens very quickly, and that needs to be integrated in a way that grounds people afterwards as well, right? That helps people put into perspective what they just experienced, how that may have been for them, but may be different for other people, what other approaches could have been fruitful in a particular moment. And so we are trying to address that risk in the clinical context. But yeah, I mean, it's something that you see all over the place, and especially here in the Netherlands, where I said before, mushrooms used to be legal. They were made illegal in 2008, and they were completely replaced by the sale of truffles, which are part of the same exact organism, have the same active ingredients, but they're just a different part, and they're not mushrooms. And mushrooms is how it's described in our Opium Act, the part that is forbidden.
Yeah.
So because they're available legally, a lot of people with this perspective in mind think I can offer therapeutic experiences or therapy or guided experiences while completely lacking any qualifications or experience. And that is, I mean, that can be risky for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's basically not, I can't boil down your very nuanced answer, but one kind of trend that I'm seeing is that there are clinicians that maybe miss the depth or like the true intention. And there are people with beautiful intentions that miss the clinical awareness or the safety awareness. And of course, you're describing your program called ADEPT, I think, and it's a 2-year program.
Correct.
One of the questions that just comes up to me now is, are you aware of what psychotherapeutic modalities, so apart from, the substances themselves, but what modalities, such as, I don't know, IFS or something with breathing, what do you see is particularly powerful, statistically speaking, with integration of psychedelic experiences?
It's a great question. And the simple answer is that we have no idea. And that is partly because what is usually studied in most clinical trials is the effect of the drug. And there are very few trials that try to isolate the added effect of psychotherapy. So, the way that you would do it is you give one group psychedelic plus psychotherapy. You give another group a psychedelic plus, some intervention. It would have to be kind of the same amount of time so you can actually compare. But like basic education or something. And another group you would give no psychedelic and only psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And if you did that, you would be able to compare the effect of that specific psychotherapy, the added value of it on the intervention, on the treatment. And then you would only have an answer if that is effective, that specific psychotherapy for that particular indication and for that particular psychedelic. But if you then add to the mix all these different kinds of psychedelics that are being studied today, and there are more and more, just yesterday, or maybe the day before, this is mid-March, we heard that psilocin, which is a kind of compound that I didn't really know, just received prime status at the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. It's a short-acting tryptamine, which acts a little bit shorter than psilocybin, but it's based on positive clinical trial results from small-scale clinical research, phase 2 research. It was bought by a big pharmaceutical company, AbbVie, and I think they have a lot of knowledge and like big teams who know how to work with regulatory agencies. So they just received a kind of a fast tracking status for regulatory approval in the EU, which is the first. Wow. But just to say, so you have like the classical psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, but you also have DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, MDMA, ketamine, if you consider that a psychedelic, ibogaine. You can ask the same question. And then all these novel compounds, consider the possible disorders that you might want to treat, like from depression, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, cocaine, opioids, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, you name it. And then add all of the psychotherapies. I mean,
super complex.
It is very complex. And the research program needed to find out, what works for whom in which combination it's almost too complex to like completely tease apart.
Yeah.
But I think more fundamentally, and this is really my perspective, I think it doesn't probably matter so much which specific therapeutic modality you choose, because a lot of it boils down to common factors. It's about being able to establish a trusting relationship with your therapist. You can have a very good therapist who's super skilled at ACT, but if you don't click, then it's likely to not be effective, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa. Maybe someone is using a modality that you think would not be a great fit, and a lot of people say this about CBT, and I would put myself in the same category. I would be a bit skeptical. I would have been, but I'm somewhat more open-minded now. But if the therapist really gets you, and you're really connecting, you really trust one another, maybe that's all it takes.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me, and I cannot speak scientifically or statistically, but with a pretty big experience with empathic space holding and that kind of tradition of nonviolent communication and other modalities that I'm trained in. One of the ways that they say it sometimes is it's the relationship that's therapeutical. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And you hit another question that I wanted to ask you because, and correct me if I'm oversimplifying stuff, which I'm probably doing, but I know that most psychedelic compounds work by more or less disabling the default mode network of the brain, and somehow, to put it simply, to shut down your filters or your normal reality organization system, and therefore you have more access to what's normally hidden. So my question is, are there any novel compounds that are truly novel in that way, that have maybe really kind of a different neurological way of working, with also different therapeutic approaches connected to them, if you're aware of any?
It's a really good question. And, my kind of boring answer would be that I personally tend to think, and this is not supported by evidence, but it's my intuition is that the therapeutic container matters much more than the specific compound. And the caveat to that is that there are compounds that are definitely different. If you take empathogens or entactogens like MDMA or methylone, I think they really do have a different mechanism of action, and it can be very, very useful for specific disorders or specific kinds of people. But if you talk about classical psychedelics, I think the therapeutic container will, in the end, be much more important. And I'm somewhat skeptical But maybe that's my own limitation of the really short acting psychedelics, and people do seem to respond really well to them as well, also therapeutically, like DMT or 5-methoxy DMT. But just conceptually, I find it hard to see how you can have a really meaningful therapeutic outcome with an experience that is so short.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's obviously of high interest to pharmaceutical companies because they wouldn't necessarily mind that any gains you get through such an interventions are short in duration, because
Yeah.
then there's an opportunity to redose and
Yeah.
bring people and do that a couple of times a year
Yeah.
or through people's lifetimes. And no one would admit that, of course, but
Yeah.
I can't get rid of the
Yeah. I
impression
mean,
that it is part of the
yeah.
rationale.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people working in all sorts of companies, including pharmaceutical companies. And if they are, how do you call that, indexed companies or something, the shareholder needs their money. So they will have a business model that generates money on a repeated basis. So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that's you see this with ketamine. J&J, pharmaceutical giant Johnson and Johnson, they developed a novel, administration method, a nasal spray to treat depression with an existing generic, patent-free compound as ketamine. And it's a blockbuster drug. So they've made over 2 billion in the US alone since the launch of Spravato, and that is exactly that model. It's a drug that is dirt cheap. It's used in human and veterinary medicine. It really doesn't cost anything. It's mass produced in company in fabrics in China and India. Those are even here locally in Europe as well. It doesn't cost anything to produce it. But you patent a novel administration, you put the whole thing through a clinical trial process, which is, it is a risk, and I get all of that. But is it like, are you doing something that is revolutionary or really, offering something more deep or meaningful? I don't think, you're reaching the full potential of what these kinds of compounds can do.
Yeah. It seems like a cash cow.
I mean, yes. And then at the same time, I think people do also still have the intention of, developing new interventions that are effective for patients. But it's, there's a little bit of both of those incentives and baked in the system. It's a systemic issue, and it's the way that drugs are developed and put through regulatory systems.
Mhm.
It's constructed in such a way that it is almost impossible to do it if you don't have a commercial company behind you. So if you as an academic wanted to develop a drug and bring it to market, you almost need a company behind you. It's almost undoable to do it as a nonprofit or an academic initiative.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that there's always nuance. And what I also like is that even though we have this, it's very easy to go into a narrative of the evil pharmaceutical companies, but just simple realization that, there are humans working there. So that kind of stops that way of thinking for me. But yeah. So we've talked a little bit about, regulatory landscape, business models, science. I'm curious to shift it a little bit more to the human being, Joost, if that's okay.
Sure.
And then specifically, I don't know if spirituality is a dirty word for you. You can tell me in a minute, but I'm curious maybe, if you want to share, do you still use psychedelics? And if you do, how has your work with open and all this scientific awareness maybe changed your relationship with your own use or non-use of psychedelics?
That's a really interesting question. So, I mean, I have 3 children, the youngest of whom is 2, the oldest is 9. And, as a parent yourself, you can probably testify that, in addition to work, it takes up most of my time. And I think in order for a psychedelic experience to be effective and to have a positive impact, you need to plan well before and after and have enough time, to sit with whatever you experience and to process it and to integrate it. And that's something I have very little time for, or maybe don't make enough time for, or am not capable of, planning far enough ahead to make that space. So I've had very, very few experiences over the past years. But it's okay. It's okay too. I mean, it's something that I find valuable once in a while, but um, I'm doing fine without them. And I think a lot of the lessons that I got from my early experiences, it's, putting those into practice and incorporating those into my, my worldview or the way I live my life or my behaviors has more impact probably than, cramming in like a psychedelic experience now would have. And maybe that's not even true. I don't know. Maybe that's how I justify it to myself. But yeah. And I mean, you asked earlier if spirituality is a dirty word. I don't think it is. I think it's, the way that most people use spirituality is it's either associated with very new agey, unscientific stuff, or more on the, commodified wellness side, like, kind of happiness magazines with Buddha statues that you buy at the, the local mass producer store, the Exarhos, as we would have in the Netherlands. But true spirituality, being in touch with something larger than yourself, I think it's a very healthy and important aspect of being human. And I think that's the case for me too.
Yeah. Do you have, having a family and being attuned to that is a spiritual practice in itself, I think. Do you have any other thing that you would call a spiritual practice, or some way that you kind of keep cultivating your awareness, or is that already coming from your work with Open and Adapt?
I mean, I think work is so instrumental that I wouldn't count that in such a way. I think, and from my perspective, in order to properly practice something like that, you need to sit with it and practice it. I think for me, meditation is something that that comes closest to it, which for me is something that goes also in waves. Also with, depending on the phase of my kids. If my kids wake me up 3 times in the night, I find it very hard to, set my alarm earlier than everybody else.
Yeah.
Wake up and sit for 30 minutes before the day starts, which would be my preference, and which is, I have phases for years that it's possible, and I'm in a phase now where I've, it's slipped a little bit. Yeah. But for me, that is very important. I've been practicing capoeira for 25 years, and I'm not sure I would call it a spiritual practice per se, but it comes somewhat close to it. I don't know if you know capoeira. It's a martial art from Brazil, which incorporates a lot of culture, music, dance, martial arts. It's a full body practice. You need to be very much in the moment if you practice it. And for me, it's something that keeps me sane as well.
Yeah, it's super athletic and acrobatic if you're kind of good at it. And I also, what I believe I know is that the people who practiced that martial art weren't allowed to practice martial art, so they kind of were disguising it as a dance. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. These were, slaves, enslaved people from Africa who were brought to South America. That's the origins of capoeira for sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I miss myself. I love meditation, and I if I can only do one thing, it'll be meditation. It's just so powerful, and I would love to do a bit more movement. But yeah, as I think we have a really young kid and an even younger kid, so it's a bit in the red zone right now. But it's super important. I want to shift gears a little bit more. We talked a bit about the science, personal, but maybe also societal. Of course, there was the big psychedelic wave in the 60s, and I think that wasn't called a wave, but that's what we look at now. And I think was maybe the 90s and maybe the early 2000s that we call the second wave, and then the third wave was microdosing, something like this, or at least that's how it's called.
I think I think it's only the microdosing people who use that.
Right. Okay. 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 Shelving that for the moment. it's interesting, when you take that perspective of the 60s, things went well, things went maybe not so skillful, but people tried. Now we're here in this moment where we are so mature, I think. And, as you say, some of those compounds are reaching the finish line of, I guess it's the fourth stage of the trials, which is human testing, right? And so, from that perspective of where we came from, where we are now, where do you think we're going in the next, let's say, 30 years? And where do you think we should go? What do we need most going forward in the next few decades?
I mean, I wouldn't dare to make any predictions about where we're going, because I'm kind of past the point of shock, like for a few years now, but it's not so long ago. And also when you were still involved with Open, I mean, this was all we were very much at the front of a wave that was only then just slowly starting to build. And at some point it picked up momentum, and you have all these pharmaceutical companies that are, just raising millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions that are listed at stock markets. And, it's impossible to follow all of the scientific publications that are coming out. And we are nearing a point that, the first psychedelics may become approved very soon. I've been attending the Dutch psychiatry national psychiatry conference for years in a row, presenting on psychedelics, and it's not even an issue anymore, right? And that's something that was very different 6, 7, 8 years ago. So this influx of money, there was like a tipping point where suddenly there was enough evidence, and it was legitimate enough for people to pour money into it. And that suddenly, catapulted change, and that really changed the momentum of this whole field. That, for me, makes it impossible to make any predictions. I mean, I do have a sense of where I think it should go, but where it might go, I mean, and it can be so dependent on individual incidents, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when I said earlier that the psilocybin-containing mushrooms were banned in the Netherlands, this was all, related to an incident of a 17-year-old French girl who allegedly had bought mushrooms and maybe consumed them. We don't know. And then died, committed suicide, had an accident. We also don't know for sure. But the French government put such pressure on the Dutch government that the Dutch government thought, or at least our Christian Democratic conservative Minister of Health and Justice, decided we should ban mushrooms altogether. Which is a simple way for politicians to solve a problem by just forbidding it.
Yeah.
And these things can change very, very suddenly because of a combination of factors that are impossible to predict. What I would hope is, and that we are trying our best to contribute to, is that we find the culturally appropriate containers for psychedelics to be integrated in a way that is safe and ethical and beneficial. And to a degree, what I find interesting about being in the Netherlands, it's already happening. If you look at the proliferation of retreat centers and individual guides and facilitators who offer guided truffle sessions in the Netherlands, there are websites that you can go to. If you fill in the Netherlands, there are like 400 different providers, and that definitely doesn't list all of them. So there are lots of them out there, and these are, this is a kind of process that is only now slowly maturing. I don't think it's maybe in an early adolescent stage. So then there will be a period where, there will be incidents in that context too. But there are also people involved in self-regulating, in bottom-up regulating, and that has already happened with ayahuasca organizers, of which there are quite a few in the Netherlands as well. Even though it's illegal, it's not prosecuted either. But there are a few very conscientious organizers of ceremonies who got together, and despite the fact that they all have very different approaches, some of which are more religious, some of which are more neo-shamanic, more spiritual, more like full South American shamanic, they still agree that it's really important to have minimal safety and ethics and medical standards. So that there will be in my ideal future, there will be parallel pathways for people to access psychedelics safely, responsibly, ethically, for whichever reason they want. So if it's for their religious service or for self-development or for spiritual reasons. And the thing that I'm most involved in is for medical care, for therapeutic care, that there are systems in place, that there are checks in place, that we have an understanding of who is allowed to administer these substances, what is the amount of care that needs to be provided, what is the minimal amount of care, which are the professions that need to be involved, what level of training do the professions need to be, what does good care consist of, in such a way that one doesn't detract from the other. So my fear would be that this whole focus on medicalization, which is happening, means that the powers that be, or the forces that will happen in society, in trying to streamline and manage these things, think that the only legitimate reason for people to take psychedelics or be prescribed psychedelics is for therapeutic purposes. Which, if you consider the long history of psychedelic use and the different systems around cultural systems around psychedelic use, there are very many different use regions and contexts in which people use psychedelics, and these are, I think, equally legitimate.
Yeah, not just medical, but also spiritual and self-understanding.
Yeah, and I think our challenge is to do that in such a way that that fits our society. So I don't think we can import Mexican curanderos or shamans from the Peruvian or Brazilian rainforests or from Gabon or from anywhere else to the Netherlands, explain to us, how they work with them and what it means in terms of cosmology and in terms of worldview, and then adopt it for our own. I think we need to, we can take a lot of inspiration from that, but I think we need to develop approaches that fit within our worldview. And I think that they can potentially have a positive impact on, how we relate to our natural environment and to others as well. But I think, finding ways that are appropriate, that fit and that make sense for our societies in the West, I think that is a major challenge.
That's very interesting. I like that approach because it's what you're speaking to seems to me that instead of just kind of adopting dogmatically some other kind of cultural framework for these compounds, although they have, of course, a super mature relationship with them, it's not our relationship. So it's actually going to a dialogue with that work. And speaking to the future, one question that came up as well is, it seems a matter of time until artificial intelligence will create a new psychedelic compound. That just seems like a possibility. It's probably profitable. It's at least interesting. So, within a decade, that's probably going to happen. Have you heard anything about this, or what is your thought about that? Should we even want that, or should we really not want that? What is your sense of that possibility?
I am pretty agnostic to it, mainly because my feeling is, or I think that's when you look at the history of the development of chemistry in developing new psychedelic compounds, you can develop a new psychedelic compound that is structurally very, very similar to existing compounds, that is totally inert in humans, doesn't do anything. If you look at the fantastic books written by Sasha Shulgin, Pikal and Tikal, where he describes developing hundreds of new psychedelic molecules, the way he does it is by taking a known molecule and then tweaking it, adding an atom here, adding a little extension there, and then you have to bioassay in order to figure out that is indeed active in humans, and that is not something that can be replaced by computer systems. I would think, it's something that requires humans to be able to figure out, okay, is this actually biologically, psychologically active? So what if they can help develop structures that might, attach to specific receptors more efficiently or fit better or have a potential effect? I mean, why not? I don't have anything against the concept, but you would still need to figure out exactly what it does. And, you can't create something within a computer system and then have it tested by the same computer system and then, think that it automatically translates into humans as well, because that's not the way it's worked out so far. I mean, the same is true for other animals, right? You test compounds in animals, and the large majority of, testing fails to translate into humans. And that, I assume, will be the case there too.
All right. Yeah. So maybe that's just, I'm just completely underestimating the complexity and the subtlety of how those compounds work. And so we're not there yet by a long shot, according to your sense of it.
I mean, and this is also just me coming at it from a relatively non-expert perspective, right? But I know I've read Schugin's books, and I know that, structural similarity, and you can have two molecules that are almost the same, but one has a chloro atom and the other one has a fluoro atom, and they can be super active and completely inert. Yeah. If you make this little change. And so, changing molecules structurally predicting of whether they will have an effect on humans is very, very hard.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to underestimate, the power of these prediction tools, and that I'm also not knowledgeable enough to be able to say if they can.
Me neither. I just like to fantasize about it, and that seemed like a cool question. But I like the reality as well, the realism. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about ICPR, which is of course the Congress. I think it's in May, coming up the next one.
It's in June. 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, 3, 4, 5, 6 June 2026.
Yeah. And for people listening or watching, can you share a bit about maybe the history of ICPR? What is it, and maybe what you're most looking forward to?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, it's a thing that we do every 2 years. We organize, I think, one of the largest scientific conferences on psychedelics. It's a serious scientific conference. It's called the Interdisciplinary Conference on Psychedelic Research, which we've been doing since 2010. This will be our 7th edition, and it's it's a conference that really tries to address scientific research, but also clinical perspectives on psychedelics from every possible angle, from legal perspectives to the newest findings in clinical research, for new indications, to what do psychedelics teach us about consciousness? Can they inform us about consciousness? What kind of research can we do? To neurochemical research. I mean, it's a very broad field, which is why I love it, and it's a very interdisciplinary event, which means that we try to curate it in such a way that there will always be something interesting for anyone there. So we have multiple parallel tracks, so people can choose to at the same time go to a neuroscience track, or to an anthropological presentation, or to something more clinical or more philosophical. And what we try to do, what we hope to do, is for people who are in the field, or who people who are new to the field, that they become enticed to visit something that they wouldn't have come across or wouldn't have gone to in a conference in their own field, right? So there is a lot, but we are very strict. We have high standards in terms of scientific quality. We have an extensive review process, which is something that we've been doing for the past months. It's an immense process, because the more known the conference becomes, the more people submit abstracts who want to speak at the conference. So the more picking and choosing we have to do. But it's a gathering of between 1,200 to 1,500 people for 4 days in Haarlem, which is a beautiful city in the historic the historic center of Haarlem, very close to Amsterdam. We have multiple workshops the day before the conference on working with end of life and grief and psychedelics, MDMA assisted therapy for couples, which is something that I'm super curious about.
That's how it started out, right? MDMA. That was the first application, I believe.
Yeah, you're very right. Yeah. It was a lot of it was done in couples therapy, and in this case, the clinical edge to it is that one of the couple has to have PTSD. So it's MDMA therapy, MDMA assisted therapy to treat couples in which one has PTSD, but in which the partner obviously also suffers from living with a partner with PTSD, because that can be very, very hard. But we also have a more a more odd workshop, which is something that I am very. It's not an odd workshop per se. It's odd in the sense of that it's not necessarily only scientific, or not necessarily only about psychedelics, which is a workshop with Palestinians and Israelis who do peace work and activism together, in which they use psychedelics, but they use storytelling, and they use all kinds of rituals and ceremonies for people to get closer to one another, to process grief, to increase understanding, which actually came out of research that they did. Leo Roseman, who is a neuroscientist and a researcher presently at Exeter University in the UK, but he is Israeli himself, did a few ayahuasca sessions where they brought together Israelis and Palestinians, and they did extensive work before and afterwards, but also during the ayahuasca ceremonies, with the purpose of bringing people closer together. And the stories that came out of that are very, very moving, very touching.
Yeah.
And a lot of peace work from uniting people from both sides of that divide. Has produced this full day workshop that we thought is such an important thing to address, because it's maybe today it's disappeared somewhat from the news, but it's still very much happening. It's still very much alive.
Yeah.
And it's a
the conflict
way.
You mean, or
the conflict, for sure.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that it's disappeared from the news because there are other conflicts that get more attention, but it's not solved by a long shot. And I think it's a really beautiful and sincere attempt to put work that was born out of research, put it into practical use as well. And it's a way for people also to process that. And there are many people in the Netherlands who feel very conflicted, maybe, or who have very strong feelings about it, which can hopefully bring them closer together.
Yeah. Wow. That's I'm surprised and blown away by that. Is there a link that we can put in the show notes of an article or whatever it may be about that work?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll drop you a link afterwards. There will be a description for the different workshops there as well. There's another thing that we organize on the day before the actual conference, and that will be that we'll have throughout the conference as well. We have multiple indigenous leaders as well, so we'll have a workshop or a symposium, I would say, on the Wednesday the 3rd, bringing together indigenous and Dutch perspectives. So, because a lot of what we talked about previously is bringing together, kind of extracting knowledge from the Amazon or from Latin America, from Mexico, from Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, to the Netherlands. And often people, shamans are brought here. They get to share their wisdom, lead ceremonies, and go back, but there's no real reciprocity. And this is an attempt to create a real dialogue, and for people to understand what is happening in the West, and creating an honest exchange between these two perspectives.
Yeah,
and that is part of the multi-angle, multidisciplinary conference itself as well. We bring together, we bring clinicians, we bring participants, patients who've participated in clinical trials, to bring their perspectives, which are not all positive. And I think, the most instructive ones, the ones that you can learn the most from, are actually often the the really challenging or difficult or complicated experiences that people have had, and sharing openly what has helped them, what they've learned from it, what wasn't so helpful, what was actually harmful. And clinicians and indigenous perspectives together with all these scientists. So it's a really, really interesting mix. And I find that no matter how rigorous and science oriented we make the conference, and that is really, that's really the heart of it. It is still a very, warm and open-minded and very connecting event. It's that kind of a bringing together of the scientific and clinical communities around psychedelics.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Speaking about the heart of it, I think, as you know better than me probably, but all these people come with their heart and they use science as a method, and science is cold and statistical and analytical and precise, and that's also really useful. But there's the heart of it. There's the humans coming together, and just what you just described about Israelis and Palestinians working in such a deep way together. I'm curious, how is that for you as a human to know that you have such a big contribution in that human world that we live in right now in this way? How is that for you?
For me, the way I see it, we facilitate work that others do, right? And we do collectively as an organization, as open, decide that this is something that we find important, and that it is part of it, and that this is a possible contribution to this. But I don't consider my own part in this like very important. I think what we try to do is reckon with it really honestly and sincerely, and trying to find ways that other people can relate to it in a way that is meaningful as well. And just to give an example, and this is actually kind of what partly spurred it. In the previous conference in 2024, we had a speaker, a clinician, who shared his research, which was about survivors of the Nova attack by Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. Yeah. This was it was a very touchy subject because Israel had already started the war. And at the same time, we thought, okay, this is someone who proposed this to present this at the conference. And we were aware of the sensitivities, and we felt the sensitivities ourselves as well. But at the same time, we thought, okay, this is clinically and scientifically and on a human level, it's also important to understand what happened to these people who were the victims of a terror attack, who were under the influence of psychedelics themselves, and what happened to them, and was that helpful in their healing process, or was it an impediment? But having that presentation there at the conference in a very volatile moment meant that we took extra care to make sure that people understood that if strong emotions arose around that subject, that we carefully explained what the talk would be about, what it wouldn't be about, and that if people had very strong reactions, we would have a few professionals ready to help them process it, or to integrate it, or to provide very subtle, not real therapy, but like a therapeutic container for people to express their feelings.
Yeah.
Which, like, in the end wasn't necessary, but maybe that was because of the precautions. But we are very, I think all of us are very sensitive to the fact that some subjects can raise very strong emotions, and that it's important to not push those away, but let them be there, but then also offer the kind of care and support around it that may be needed.
Yeah. And just to see if I understand this last part, because my immediate interpretation was that these people were at a festival, there's a terrorist attack. Oh, they were tripping while this was happening. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was what's happening.
Oh my God.
Yeah, this is in the middle of a psytrance festival.
Yeah. People seem to be doing some psychedelics at those places, right?
Yeah. They do.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my God. You just maybe kind of rewinding a little bit, because I wanted to explore one last facet with you, if that's okay. And you just mentioned just briefly just now the word philosophy, and I think you mentioned earlier you studied philosophy. when you look at your work right now, and when you look at what how you approach it, what philosopher or philosophy is somehow still with you from those days, or has that changed? How do you relate to your maybe philosophical heart with all of this work? And something about that maybe.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's interesting because people often introduce me as a philosopher, which I don't really consider myself. I mean, I did my master's in philosophy and my PhD in the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm by no means a psychiatrist or like a medical doctor at all. But I mean, so I did my master's thesis on William James, and I still resonate very strongly with William James, who was a just a fascinating character who was the one of the grounding persons in the development of psychology, the school of pragmatism, psychology of religion, who wrote the book that I did my master's thesis on, was the varieties of religious experience.
Yeah.
Which is just a phenomenal treatise in which, human experience is very much at the heart of it. Which he uses as the foundation of figuring out what are these kinds of experiences about, trying to untangle or to see the commonalities between different reports of experience. And that in combination with his pragmatism, which is also something that for me resonates very strongly. And especially with, claims to truth that often, people have, regarding the relation, regarding the nature of reality, or regarding, some biographical elements, some things that may have happened in their past, which can be impossible to ascertain or to verify with any measure of certainty. I think taking a very pragmatic approach and to see if it has value in people's lives, and if their worldview or their behaviors or their perspectives change for the better, then it doesn't matter so much if it was true or not. If it matters to them and it has a positive influence. And I'm flattening James's pragmatism somewhat, but I think that still stays with me very much. And then in my own research, I take a phenomenological approach, which is I do it more practically. I do kind of practical phenomenology, so to say. So I do I'm very interested in, getting to as near to someone else's experience as possible, trying to really understand how somebody else experienced something, and then trying to see if there's common ground between different people's experiences of the same phenomenon, and if it's even the same phenomenon. So, I am still connected to philosophy in that way, and working, academically in a department of psychiatry, I find it incredibly useful to have had this training in philosophy, this taking a critical perspective of everything, being able to analyze things critically, to take a higher, like a higher perspective, so to say, like a more overview meta perspective on things, which is also coincidentally the kinds of presentations at the conference that I usually enjoy the most. People trying to make sense of broader developments, broader experiences, trying to see what it means for science, or for experience, or for society. Those kinds of big questions for our understanding of consciousness or our metaphysics. Those kinds of things I find absolutely fascinating, while still also recognizing that, I'm sure we're getting somewhere, but I'm not sure where that somewhere it really is.
Yeah, nicely put.
Which is very, very, very philosophical.
Yeah, but it's also
just know what we
open.
don't know, right?
Yeah. I really like that. And I may have mentioned in our kind of pre-talk that I love phenomenology. That's kind of, for me, that was the way out of all that mental stuff. So yeah. And I've never read William James, but he is hovering in my subconscious to one day read something. But yeah, I think that's
I can recommend reading James. There are lots and lots of philosophers that I know I really, really struggled reading. I had to make a conscious effort, and it could take me an hour to read a page of Hegel. But William James is really accessible. He writes beautifully, lyrically. understandably, like even for a layperson. I mean, maybe not like 100%, but it's accessible and understandable, and it's deep, and it's powerful in its own way. So that really speaks in favor of James for sure. And the varieties of religious experience is a good place.
Yes, that was exactly my question. So without having talked a lot at all recently, there's so many kind of automatic flow in this conversation. I want to thank you for that. But also before we round it up, is there anything that we kind of haven't spoken about that's left in the air, or that you would like to mention maybe?
I mean, there are many things we haven't spoken about. Yeah, something, I'm not sure. Maybe something will come up after we wrap up. That is important. But yeah, I mean, for those listening, maybe there's kind of a short promo. If you're interested in joining the conference, I can highly recommend it. It's a beautiful event. There are still places you can still register if you go to icpr-conference.com. And for anyone who is clinically trained and who wants to train more deeply in using psychedelic assisted therapy, which is something that we didn't mention specifically. It came up kind of during our conversation, but it is a psychedelic agnostic and a trans diagnostic approach. So it doesn't train people in a specific psychotherapeutic modality, but really helps them become more proficient and competent in the therapeutic approaches that they're already trained in, and allowing them to add working with altered states of consciousness and psychedelics in their work, which means that, once they do become approved, we'll have clinicians who are properly ready, trained for, if they want to work with psychedelic assisted therapies.
Yeah.
And that is called ADEPT, indeed.
Yes, and the link is in the description below, as will be the link for the upcoming ICPR and the link you will share about what was it? I forget for a moment.
The workshops.
The workshops about Palestinians and Israelis.
Exactly.
What beautiful work. I'm inspired and touched by what you're doing. Thanks very much for spending here time with me and the listeners. Give you the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. This is a really pleasant, lovely reconnection. I hope to see you in June.
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks, Joost.
Cheers, Hans.
Congratulations on making it all the way to the end of this episode of the Non-Dual Communication podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. I found it very engaging. Joost has been kind enough to offer a special discount to listeners and or watchers of the podcast. So if you want to go to the ICPR conference, which I highly recommend that you do if you have a chance and if you have the curiosity, you'll have a 10% discount at the checkout if you use the code NDC10. So that is NDC10. That's for non-dual communication. 10% discount. Check it out. Again, thank you for listening or watching, and see you around.